we are going to jump into, our anticipated topic for today, the one that we actually planned ahead for and had notes for, and the one that we are that we got
And
all the
still
notes.
very important, if
Yes.
not more so today.
Well, good point. Good point. We are going to discuss the defensive line today, Brian, and this is by far one of the strengths of this team, not only of the defense but of the entire team itself. And so we're going to kind of dive into, the defensive line as a whole, and then of course we're going to get into individual players, who's going to break out, newcomers, all of that fun stuff. And I'm excited for this one because it's always fun to talk about really good players, Brian, and there is no shortage of really good players on this defensive line.
There's not. And when you look at this defensive line, Vince, and just kind of quickly relay it back to the conversation we just had, there's going to be a lot of true serum handed out to the Notre Dame offensive tackles over the next month.
Yes.
And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing, because you've got to get ready to play some very good defensive ends in the first game of the year. Very defensive lineman, first game of the year. Best way to get ready for playing against really good defensive linemen and on August 31st is to have to face really good defensive linemen every single day in practice.
And that is what this offensive line will face every single day of practice. That's
absolutely. Sure. And now we just got to find out, okay, how good are they going to be? Because like really, Vince, and as we kind of get into this first section, that's what a lot of the conversation is about is, how good really were they last year? And how good are they going to be now? And how good do they have to be?
Sure.
And it's interesting because there's a very, very big variation of opinion amongst Notre Dame fans in regard to how good was last year's defensive line. And I think part of it is because there's a lot of emphasis put on sacks and pressures without an understanding of what Notre Dame's defense is and how they are meant to generate sacks and pressures. But when you look at it, last year's defensive line, I think most people can agree on this. And I want to have the conversation be here. Instead of spending 30 minutes arguing, are they top 5 or top 10? Let's just say the vast majority of the people can argue that last year it was a top 10 defensive line. Can we in the chat and those listening at home, can we at least agree that it's certainly comfortable? We're all comfortable saying they were top 10, right? And some weeks they were top 5 and other weeks they weren't top 5. So we can say, okay, top 10. So then the question is, Vince, is that good enough? Was that good enough? Like if Notre Dame simply repeats what it was last year on the D line, is that good enough for this team to be able to go out there and play for a championship? And I think that's a fair question.
Yeah.
Or do they need – does this – and not every team has to have a top 5 defensive line to win a championship. LSU didn't in 2019. Alabama 2020 didn't. We're talking about the makeup of this Notre Dame football team. I don't think Michigan could have won last year if they didn't have a top 5 defense.
Completely agree.
They needed it. Notre Dame, I think, needs it. Even if the offense is better, the question is can they play that level? Does it need to be top 5? That's a fair question, because in certain years in the past, in 2017 and 2015, if Notre Dame had a top 10 defensive line, that team could have beat anybody. In 2012, they had a top 5 defensive line, and it still wasn't good enough because other parts of the team weren't good enough. So that's kind of the question, is not necessarily just about the D line, Vince, but my question to you is top 10, and when we say top 10, we're saying outside the top 5, is that good enough for this football team to say, okay, we are a top 10 defensive line, let's say 6 to 10, somewhere in there. Is that good enough for this football team of what we know about this team right now for them to go out there and compete for a championship? Or is it more of just a one and done, 1+1 and done type of scenario? That's the question that we have about if they simply just repeat what they were last year. If they just do what we know and what they've proven they can do.
It's funny that the way this day has shaken out from a Notre Dame news standpoint, when we first went over this about 2 hours ago, and we were kind of going over these questions, and and I was thinking, whenever we go over the outline of the show, we talk about questions and things. Of course, you think about what your answers are going to be and things like that. And 2 hours ago, my answer would have been, you know what? If they repeat what they did in 23, they'll be just fine. And they will be able to supplement what I think the offense is going to be. And I think they can go out and they could potentially be in championship discussion at that point. They're going to be a playoff team. At the very least, they win one game and go on to the next round, that type of thing. And they have the possibility of advancing even further. Well, in the last hour, I feel like my answer has changed slightly. Now, here's my caveat. Here's why it has changed. Now, obviously, with the news about Charles Jagasaw going down and being lost for the season, it adds even more question marks to a position group that we had question marks to begin with because they didn't have their starting five solidified yet. And we liked where things were trending. And I think you and I both felt good about the offensive line and where they definitely could end up by the end of the year and win playoffs and when it matters, right? Well, you just threw a giant curveball with the offensive line. Do I think they can still be a very good offensive line depending on how things shake down? Sure. It's a possibility. I think the percentage of certainty on that has gone down a little bit. Okay, because of what has happened, right? And so in order to cover up for some of that percentage, I feel like the defensive line needs to pick up that a little bit. Does that make sense? Like I feel like the defensive line now needs to pick up the slack a little bit for my drop in confidence of the offensive line. I would say my confidence is still very good for the offensive line. I think it'll take maybe a little bit longer to get them where they need to be. But we're talking about at the end of the season, we're talking about competing for championships in the playoffs. That's 12, 13 games from now. So much can happen. So much can change between now and then. But I feel like I'll feel a lot better if the defensive line takes another step to kind of cover up for my drop in percentage and confidence in the offensive line. So with all of that being said, do I think they need to be the same as last year? They could probably still get it done at that point, but my confidence level goes up significantly if they can take another step up and be a little bit better than they were last year.
I think that's fair. I would argue if we're talking about winning a championship, I actually think they already needed to be better than they were last year.
Okay.
I do. And especially when it comes to rushing the quarterback and playing with consistency. Like somebody in the chat said, were they a top 10 run defense last year? Well, number one, they were not a top 10 run defense last year. Al Golden doesn't care about being a top 10 run defense. He needs to be good against the run.
Sure.
But in modern football, it's like, yeah, you got to be good against the run, but I don't care about being top 10. He said that. That's not the focus. But the run defense has to get better. I would argue that the issues with the run defense last year weren't necessarily related to the defensive line. They were more second and third level related when they had those issues, right? And so when you think about the 60-yard touchdown run against Ohio State, that was a play about your corner and your safety. D-line did their job. Linebacker Maris didn't do his job on that play. Xavier Watts didn't do his job on that play. And then Cam Hart got held. But you need to be overall just better. I don't care about being top 10 against the run, but you need to be better. I did a whole show about that this summer. You got to be better. You've got to finish better at the quarterback. We've talked about that, Vince. You've got to do a better job there. Sure. You've got to take it to another level. The question for me is, I think it is that what I want to see for the defense to truly become elite, or is it more about can they still be, if they just repeat last year, is that good enough to win a championship? My answer would be if nothing else changes on the team, then no, it's not good enough. You need to be better to carry the team. If the offense improves in the manner in which we expect the offense to improve, is it good enough? Yes. And then also, how much better does the offense have to be for Notre Dame to be able to compete for championship with the D-line just being as good as it was last year?
Sure.
So a lot of that has to do with other parts that have nothing to do with the D-line. But the D-line can only control itself. We always say control the controllables, right? And the defensive line can't do anything about the linebackers, the corners, the safeties, the offensive line, the offensive coordinator, any of that kind of stuff. They can only control what they can control. And what they can control is being more disruptive, being more dynamic, and being more consistent, because this is the point that Andrew Gilmore was kind of getting at in the chat is, number one, every defensive line has bad games, right? Every single one. In some of the best defensive lines I've ever seen in my life have days where they weren't as good as they probably should have been. They do. Georgia 2021. I mean, it was one of the best defensive lines of the last 6 or 7 years. I mean, you had first-round draft picks on the second team on that group, right? And then they come out against Alabama in the SEC title game, and they can't get after the quarterback, and Alabama rips them up on the offensive side of the ball. They lose 41-24. Everybody has those kind of days. Alabama went for 536 yards and 7.7 yards per play in that game. The most yards they gave up at any point in time prior to that game was 387 to that really good Hendon Hooker-led Tennessee team. They gave up 7.7 yards per play to Alabama that day. The highest yards per play against them previously was 4.83 by South Carolina. Everybody has bad days. But I do think that last year Notre Dame's defensive line didn't have enough of the really dominant games for me to be okay with that occasional down game, right? So that's what I say is the overall level of play needs to increase, in my opinion, in order for them to carry the team. However, if the O-line, if the offensive side becomes the unit it's capable of, and they don't miss a beat at linebacker in the secondary, I actually do think last year can be good enough. So part of me saying they need to be better, Vince, is about that they need to be better in order to make up for other areas maybe not being as good as they were last year, or as good as we hope they can be. So I think that the baseline is repeat last year. If they repeat last year, they've got a chance. That's what I would say. They got a chance. They can't regress. In order for me to feel even better about this team taking a step as a program, I think the defensive line can be that. And we should expect that from them, Vince, because it's a deep group, it's a talented group, and it's a very experienced group. And there's some questions that we got to figure out, and we'll dive into those questions as we go along, Vince. But, the reality is if this defense can improve, it can be better. And then what does that mean to improve? As I said, finish at the ball better. That's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of this D-line. Finish at the ball better means two things, right, Vince? Be even better with block destruction, and holding your point of attack when need be, and then two, finishing at the ball. Get to the ball. Tackle better, right? I mean, if Riley Mills would have tackled better last year, we'd be having a completely different conversation about how good. If just that one thing about his game improves, we may actually be having a different conversation about him, because we may be talking about how well he's looking in the NFL camp that he's a part of.
Well, that's a good point.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's
so it's kind of a double-edged sword, as far as like he wasn't a complete player last year,
right.
And so he came back to become a more complete player,
right?
And it's a double-edged sword.
He was very good last year. It's just you got to finish better. You need to turn some of those disruptions into finished plays where you're getting TFLs and hits on the quarterback.
Yeah.
So I think that's the area where I say are those two things right there, right? Getting to the ball and all that entails, and finish better. That's because they were close, Vince. They were really, really close.
Yeah, I
last
agree.
year. It's just that's what you need to do.
Well, and I think we've talked about this a lot, and we're probably going to talk about it even more tomorrow when we talk about the linebackers. But I think there's been an increase in athleticism, I think, overall with this defense in general, especially the front seven. And so that will help them, I think, be put into position to make those TFLs and some of those disruptive plays behind the line of scrimmage, but they still need to complete them. We've seen over the last 2 years under Al Golden's defense, they're not having the issue getting to the ball in the backfield. They're getting to the ball, in my opinion. They're just not finishing. And so there's got to be an emphasis on finishing, I think, even more this year. But again, with that increase in athleticism up front, I think they have an opportunity to do that. We'll just have to wait and see if that comes to fruition or not. And that will have a tremendous impact, obviously, on this team and on this defense and what they are able to do. Because you and I both know, 2nd and 13 is a heck of a lot different than 2nd and 7. When you're diving into the playbook and trying to figure out what to call on 2nd down or 3rd and long as opposed to 3rd and short, all of those different things. And so, that's going to be up to this defensive line. Can they be disruptive? Can they finish the plays that they were in position to finish last year and just overall didn't finish enough of them?
And we'll get into some specifics and segments of the show that are upcoming, but obviously the edge is going to be a big part of that. More production from the edge is going to be a big part of that. And the other part of that, which again, we're just kind of previewing what's to come with the rest of the show, the backups have to be more disruptive. And to me, here's the final piece too, Vince. Especially with the news that we learned today about the offensive line, with the fact that you're playing Texas A&M, with the fact that you are having a situation where, I'm trying to think of the way to say this. You've got a lot of talent in the back end, but it's a lot of new parts. You got a new nickel. You're going to have a new Will, a new Mike. Now, the new Will is going to be a guy that's played a bunch, but he didn't play at will. And Jack Kaiser. You've got a very experienced boundary safety that's got over 2,000 snaps of college football in his career, and Rod Hurd, but 0 in a Notre Dame uniform and at that safety position, right? So, and you've got a brand new field corner. So you've got some very important parts that are missing. I think where this defense really needs to, this D-line really needs to be at its best. They need to start the season off better than they did last year. And I think that's one area where I would say, I actually think, I say you don't blame the playing Navy on things, and I'm not blaming them for anything, but I do think when you are preparing to play Navy in the first game of the year, it's 2 weeks of work from your D-line where they're not worried about getting to the quarterback and they're not worried about getting to the ball carrier per se. They're worried about eating up gaps and keeping guys off their legs and freeing up your runners. It's a little bit of a different deal when you talk about your D-line. Was there an adjustment period after that? That's a good question, since it did happen so early. So now you don't have that potential excuse. You've got to start off early, because one of the most annoying narratives for me this offseason has been the obsession of talking about the Notre Dame offensive line against the Texas A&M defensive line and how that could be a matchup that is why Notre Dame loses that game. And then nobody wants to talk about the Notre Dame defensive line against the A&M offensive line. A&M has just as many. A&M would love to have a couple of Notre Dame's backup offensive tackles right now. Like, they would be very happy with that to play opposite Trey Zoom, right? That's just – their offensive line was a mess last year. They've also got to block the Notre Dame defensive line, and that's going to be a big part of that game, Vince, is they need to go out and have the kind of game where we can look back and say, this is why you all were talking about the wrong things all summer, because of that right there. Yes, Notre Dame's offensive line needs to figure out a way to block a really talented Texas A&M defensive line. But how's Texas A&M going to block a really good Notre Dame defensive line? If the Notre Dame defensive line doesn't play to their potential, then it becomes a problem, because you now have to figure out, okay, how do we stop this team with the best part of our defense, at least in game one, isn't playing like an elite group or a top 10 group. So even if they are just top 10, they need to be top 10 day one, where last year, Vince, I don't think they were as good in September as they were in October, November, the D-line.
Sure.
They're going to have to start a little bit faster, and I think the edge is going to be a big part of that, and the depth is going to be a big part of that.
Well, and they're going to have to start faster because the level of competition is obviously higher, or one of the reasons they have to start faster. And everything you said is absolutely accurate, but they're going to have to start faster because game one isn't Navy. Bottom line, game one isn't Navy. Game one's Texas A&M, who's a top 25 ranked team, and you're going to their place when they're, fans are going to be going bonkers because there's 0-0, and they got a new head coach, and they got their quarterback healthy, and, go down the list of reasons for Texas A&M fans to be excited. It's there. And so the defensive line, when we're doing the post-game show on August 31st, if Notre Dame wins that game, we're going to be talking about the defensive line and the plays that they made.
If they win.
Line. If they win, yes, I'm saying.
Because I don't think they can if the defensive line doesn't
play well.
Completely agree with that.
So Before we jump into some more specifics, make sure you hit the like button, the subscribe button, the notification bell, share with your family and friends, all the good stuff. And make sure you jump on the boards.irishbreakdown.com. A lot of good discussion going to be happening over there, I have a feeling, over the next 24 to 48 hours. And of course, tomorrow we've got a live look into practice, and that's where the practice report goes, folks. So if you want that practice report, you better check out boards.irishbreakdown.com.